Great. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here today on this rainy Tuesday. Again, my name is Ann. I am a former teacher, teacher leader, and principal, and the power of teacher leadership has really brought me to where I am now at an organization called Teachers Supporting Teachers that I'll be chatting a little bit about later on in this session. But the spoiler alert or the hot take is that as a principal, I burnt out pretty quickly because of the top-down approach that we often took to the work. And so when I had a chance to work at a network that believed heavily in teacher leadership and see the impact of it, I knew I wanted to be part of making it happen in more schools. And so I currently am doing just that as the director of coaching and curriculum at Teachers Supporting Teachers. So I'm excited to spend a little bit of time with you this afternoon to explore distributed leadership and hopefully use the expertise of the room to elevate all of our practices. And so with that, here are the objectives that we hope to accomplish today. Take just a minute to read through those. And we will accomplish them through the following agenda. So we'll take some time to explore distributed leadership, teacher leadership, and the umbrella that sits under, common issues with distributed leadership in schools, next steps for implementation. As I mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about TST's role, have a Q&A, and then we will close out. That as we dive into the session today, before we get started on the content, something that I'd love to do is to have you each set an intention. So it's been something that's incredibly helpful for me, especially as right now we're at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, and I know that everyone is coming in with very different feelings, mindsets, and whatever you are coming into from the day. I'd love for you to pause just for a minute to set an intention for the next about an hour that we're going to spend together. Anything that you are hoping to get out of the session or hoping to do during the session, please feel free to just, again, silently reflect on an intention that you'd like to set for that. And I will do the exact same thing on my own. So again, during today's session, we're going to have an opportunity to explore distributed leadership. I want to name that it's going to be a little bit more of me talking than usual, but there are some moments already plugged in where we'll get to use the chat function specifically, so be ready to do that. And then a few other moments where we'll be able to poll to see where we are at as a room. And so we will kick it off just chatting first about just a broad overview that many of you are likely very familiar with. So there are many methods of organization, of leadership in organizations, I should say, and many reasons why an org might choose a certain kind of leadership. So to begin, there's distributed leadership, which can often be referred to as top-down management and often is the default. This is a very hierarchical style of management. The power and the decision-making generally remain with those at the top, and information then can sometimes flow slowly and only one directionally. It's up to everyone else to implement the vision that's determined by, as it were, the leadership team. The next type of leadership that we have is decentralized leadership. So in contrast, in decentralized organizations, formal decision-making power is distributed across individuals or teams. That said, many times there's a risk of silos or even duplicated efforts or resources if there's not enough communication happening between the teams. The last kind of leadership is distributed leadership, which in contrast to both, distributed leadership pushes leadership and accountability across and down an organization. This is a case where many folks share the responsibility of the decision-making processes. Obviously, there are pros and cons to each type of leadership and reasons why organizations might choose certain styles. In this webinar, we're going to be really hitting on the pros of using distributed leadership in schools. And this is especially important for principals. So shout out to all you principals here in the audience. As the graphic shows, principals' caseloads hugely surpass those of other industries. So the average principal caseload is nearly 10 times greater than that of other managers in highly skilled industries. So finding ways to share the load is really paramount in schools. And this leads us to distributed leadership. So distributed leadership in its simplest form, again, pushes leadership and accountability down and across an organization. Many people share the responsibility in decision-making processes, which allows a school to move in sync and to drive towards iterative improvements. Distributed leadership helps schools become more effective over time as leadership gravitates to those with appropriate skills and knowledge within an organization. Put another way, distributed leadership works to increase the capacity within a school in order to become a more effective educational institution. Ultimately, distributed leadership is about giving multiple leaders in schools autonomy by empowering them to lead their teams and drive forward strategies that contribute towards whole school priorities. So defining it is the first step. The next step is to determine where you are currently at in your distributed leadership practice, whether you are in a school or in an education adjacent org. On the screen, you'll see the distributed leadership continuum that shows the movement from traditional delegation to assertive distribution. Many folks may find themselves in their schools at different places on the continuum, and I'd love for you to answer the poll that'll pop up in just a minute, which is where does your school land, or your org land for that matter, on this continuum. So take just a minute to read through some of the characteristics of each, and then a poll should be popping up in just a minute, asking you where you particularly land on it. And I unfortunately am not able to see the poll right now. Arlen, just checking in, were folks able to answer that?
Let me launch the poll. It's open now.
Yes, okay. It's popping up now. Again, think on where does your school or your org, for those of you who are not in a school-based role, land on the distributed leadership continuum. Take just a minute to answer that question, and then we'll see where we land.
Okay, looks like we've got about 70%, 72% participation. I'm going to end the poll and show the results.
Amazing, excellent. So it looks like we have a strong population that's closer to traditional delegation, and then a good chunk of us that are closer to the middle, which is great, and then a few less of us that are closer to assertive distribution, which is amazing. It's why we're all here to hopefully continue to move closer to assertive distribution. So thanks so much for taking some time to answer that poll. Regardless of where you place yourself, again, as I said, the goal is to move towards assertive distribution. And one way to start or to continue your movement towards that is to define what teacher leadership looks like at your school. And so I'd love for you right now to take just a minute to brainstorm, and then in the chat, pop in key teacher leadership attributes. So what are some things that you think of as a key attribute of a teacher leader? Again, take a minute to brainstorm and then pop that in the chat. Make sure that the chat says to everyone so that we can all kind of see where we're landing in terms of those key attributes. And I'm realizing I should have shared my sound too, so we can have some nice music in the meantime. It's always that silence while we're waiting for the chats to come in. So thank you for enjoying the silence at this point. Again, we'll wait for some of those chats to pop up. Absolutely. Empathy, listening skills, integrity, good communicator. I love that. Visionary, building and maintaining relationships. Yes. Collaboration, seeing a lot on relationships. Taking initiative, risk taker, honesty for sure. I always like the chat waterfall, which is it's nothing and then it all flows in. Trustworthy for sure. Yes. Yes. Systems thinker. Absolutely. Yep. Thank you all for those thoughts. Keep popping them in as they come to you. In a recent PD, we asked principals to do this same work. So define the key characteristics of teacher leadership. We also got a range of answers, some of which you all had chatted about just now. So from risk taker to someone who's nurturing to mobilizer to someone with strong content knowledge. The answers were a huge range. And principals obviously are not the only ones looking to define teacher leadership. So the NEA, again, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, has defined teacher leadership based on competencies. So they think about them in terms of DEI, overarching instructional leadership, policy leadership, and association leadership, each with different skill sets identified within them. If you haven't had a chance to, highly recommend you to check out, again, the NEA teacher leadership competencies and see their take on defining it. There are also the teacher leader model standards, and these standards define teacher leadership in domains. So from fostering a collaborative culture all the way to the last domain, which is advocating for student learning in the profession. For those of you in CPS, which I think there's just a few of us here today, in Chicago, we have Lead with CPS, which is a tool within CPS that defines the roles of classroom teacher and then the roles of someone who also manages others in leadership roles, and then defines the skills inherent in each. So lots of different ways that teacher leadership is defined across spaces. One definition that we really tend to like, and I think it's pretty broad, is teacher leadership is a set of skills demonstrated by teachers who continue to teach students, but also have an influence that extends beyond their own classrooms to others within their school and elsewhere. And defining teacher leadership becomes incredibly important as across the nation, and I'm sure you all are experiencing it too. Our schools are experiencing some of the most challenging times in recent history, specifically regarding teacher satisfaction and retention. So many of us in this space are asking ourselves, how can we get teachers to stay and not just be satisfied, but be energized? And research shows that teachers stay for four kind of large reasons under this umbrella, which is sense of fulfillment with the profession, adequate supports, strong culture, climate, and/or leadership, and the ability to shape working conditions. I'd love for us now to, another poll is about to pop up. I'd love to know across the room, which of these reasons resonates most, either with yourself, if you're a teacher, or if you are a principal, which one do you think resonates with teachers within your school? Take a minute to answer that poll, and we'll see where we land. Amazing. And so Looking at where most of us are landing, we have 22% sense of fulfillment, 13% adequate supports, which is great to hear, just in terms of obviously new teacher support being huge. Strong culture, climate, and/or leadership, taking the lead with 44%, and then ability to shape working conditions as 22%. So thank you for those responses. Each of these facets, so sense of fulfillment, adequate supports, strong culture, climate, and leadership, and ability to shape working conditions, are facets of teacher leadership in schools. And so this is why distributed leadership, as an umbrella to this, is part of the answer to retaining excellent teachers and ultimately driving student outcomes, and hopefully should exist in every school. And so I'd love now to give you a chance to think about distributed leadership, and distributing leadership is not easy. And there are many issues that are associated with it, both within schools and in other orgs. I'd love for you to take a minute just to brainstorm and then pop in the chat common issues that are associated with distributed leadership in schools. So what are barriers that you've seen or that you foresee as being struggles with making distributed leadership happen in schools? Again, take a minute to brainstorm and then pop your responses in the chat, and we will wait for that waterfall to flow in. So thanks for those responses. I'm seeing pushback and lack of investment, lack of communication. Yeah, favoritism, failure to clearly define roles and responsibilities, not having enough time. Yep, lack of trust. Stuck in the way we always do it mindset, absolutely. Yep, top heavy organizations. Yep. Yes, so you all have named a lot of these, but some definitely common issues that again have come up in the chat and that often come up when thinking about how to make distributed leadership happen in schools. Our school hierarchical structure, so how the school is structured and where power lies, can often stop distributed leadership from happening. Staff competencies, so are people able to take on additional responsibilities? And then if they are able to, willingness, are they willing to assume something extra, knowing that already the role of a classroom teacher is a pretty big task, obviously, to say the least. And then we have the concept of power sharing between admin, leadership teams, and other staff members, as well as admin, leadership team, and other staff members, just understanding of the practice of distributed leadership and how teacher leadership supports that practice. So again, a lot of these mentioned in the chat, a lot of them being just, again, the common issues that you might see with being able to make this happen in schools. And so the question becomes, how can we give teachers a voice and create teacher leadership as part of a larger distributed leadership framework in our schools, which will hopefully get them to stay, and ultimately, again, for the principals here in the room, share the load of running a school. And there are really three keys to distributed leadership in schools, or for that matter, in any organization, which is accountability, autonomy, and capacity. And so what those look like on the ground are what we would call the success factors for distributed leadership in schools. And so the first being principal beliefs and supports. So principal belief in the value of distributed leadership and the commitment to reorganizing their school to empower and support teacher leaders is critical to long-term distributed leadership success. Principals also need to be engaged in leadership capacity building and providing ongoing supports to their teacher leaders. The next success factor, way to overcome a barrier, is by getting clear on the vision, roles, and responsibilities. So many of you mentioned this in the chat, just the lack of clarity being a barrier to making distributed leadership happen. So implementing teacher leadership effectively means strategically composing the leadership and organizational structures of a school. So clear roles for the teacher leaders themselves and for all staff are essential for making distributed leadership happen. The next is instructional focus. So teacher leader teams are most successful often when they're aligned around a common grade level, content, or other more narrow instructional focus. And this makes sense because this is within the wheelhouse of teachers' expertise. And so giving them opportunities to lead on this fits really well within just a great way to kickstart distributed leadership at a school. The next success factor is maximum caseload. So effective teacher leaders directly lead teams of about 1 to 6 peers, with really the team size being limited to 6. Protected time, again, that was something that was mentioned in the chat. Teacher leaders need protected time away from their instructional duties to plan and to implement high leverage leadership work. And then finally, compensation, when it is possible, being able to offer stipends or other incentives for folks who are taking on additional roles and responsibilities in schools. I'd love for you to take a quick poll here. It's about to pop up, which is seeing these different success factors for distributed leadership in schools. Which of these steps might be a good place for you and or your school or your organization to start when you think about implementing distributed leadership? Take just a minute to read through them, and then would love to hear your thoughts. Poll should be popping up now. Amazing. So we've got the results in. So we have a principal beliefs and supports at 25%, clear roles at 28%, maximum caseload being A-OK, which is great, compensation at 16%, time to lead at 9%, and instructional focus at 22%. So very much across the board, which makes a lot of sense because, again, I think when we think about distributed leadership, being very clear that based on the context, you and your school might be both at very different places on the continuum and at very different needs in terms of kicking this off. Happy to see that there are some good ideas for your next steps in terms of making this happen. So as I promised, wanted to share a little bit about teachers supporting teachers and our role in this work. So part of our job is to help ensure schools feel comfortable distributing leadership by building a teacher's leadership skills and capacity, and creating these pipelines for us is really part of the work of making distributed leadership happen in schools. So we are guided by our theory of change, which is if we invest in excellent educators and energize and empower their leadership, we will build lasting staff capacity, which ultimately will ensure better outcomes for more students. And so what this looks like on the ground, especially if you are someone who said the clear roles and responsibilities might be a good first step for you. We think about our teacher liaison role as, otherwise named teacher leader. A teacher leader, with the support of their principal, decides a year-long goal that's aligned to the school's vision. The teacher leader leads a team of their peers called the school impact team. Across the year, with the support of a TSD coach and a TSD cohort of other leaders, through the journey of both the soft skills of teacher leadership and the more tactical skills of strategic and project planning. The ultimate goal being that by the end of the year, there are better outcomes for more students, and there is really a distributed leadership system and process and structure that can begin to permeate a school and hopefully, again, do the work of helping share the load of this so important work of leading in schools. So I'd love to leave us today with this quote, which is that some days my work would be easier if I made decisions by myself, but what we are doing is too expansive for any one individual to carry alone. So with that, I want to thank you all for diving in to this intro to distributed leadership and some ways to implement it in your own context. I have left some time now. I'd love to open up the floor to some Q&A and hopefully use the expertise of the room. Any common issues or possible solutions related to distributed leadership, either in your school or in your organization, feel free to pop it in the chat or to raise your hand, and we will get to those questions. Feel free to take a minute to think about it.
If you'd like to share out on the microphone, all you have to do is raise your hand and I will enable it for you to talk. Kim, you've got your hand in the air. I think it might have been from earlier, but Kim Dewey, would you like me to allow you to talk, or do you have a question? I'll allow you to talk and you can unmute your mic, Kim, if you get a chance. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't realize I had that up. I apologize.
Oh, no worries at all. I'm always just raising my hand too. Like, it's tons of buttons to click. Again, also feel free to pop a question in the chat if something is coming to mind. Got a comment from Tim. Tim, by the way, thanks for being here. Good to see you, or at least see you in the chat. So Tim says, I've been talking to teachers who are concerned about how school structures, contracts, schedules, et cetera, are getting in the way of changing a school culture that might become more distributed. How can we help navigate that? And I think that is absolutely a question, especially here in Chicago, which Tim, I know you are familiar with, in terms of I think specifically contracts, and that's an area that I think is an ongoing thing that is not necessarily, a short answer. But what I will say is I've heard a lot of really interesting and creative ideas from principals, specifically around this idea of scheduling and thinking about how, without needing to hire tons more folks that we don't have the budget for, we can think very differently about the schedule of students during the school day and make it so that with a little bit of redistribution, and again, depending on the context of the school and depending on the staff there, we can create ways for there to be a lot more flex time. And if you're like, well, that sounds amazing and I need to hear more, really happy to chat with folks one-on-one. Again, it's very dependent on each specific school's context and structure. But in my conversations with principals, been hearing a lot about the specific schedule aspect of it and how reimagining that can oftentimes create the time and space for teacher leadership to be able to at least start to bloom, start to happen. So thank you for that question. Another question we had is, if your principal is not in this, really interesting. If your principal isn't in this PD, what's the best approach to get them on board? I love that question. And as I promised, I'd love to use the expertise of the room. I know we have quite a few principals in here. If you are so willing, would love to have you do the raise hand function. What might be something that, if you had a teacher in this PD and you weren't in it, what might be a great way for a teacher to come to you with this idea of starting to make distributed leadership happen? Again, feel free to use the raise hand function. We will unmute you. We'd love to hear from you. Again, specifically principals. And yes, you can absolutely share the recording. But we'd love to hear, again, any ideas from the room. If you're like, oh man, I got in here at 3 o'clock, I was hoping I wouldn't have to share. We'd love to hear from you nonetheless. And seeing some good ideas in the chat too, absolutely. Anything else or any other questions coming to mind? Oh, okay, Tim. Yeah, thank you, Tim. All right, I appreciate it.
Well, on that point, I think we need to think as much. I'm so appreciative that IPA is doing this this webinar, and then that you're doing this, Ann. I think we need to think about the culture that we find, that administrators find themselves in, and the way that we're trained as administrators, which is not always about distributed leadership, for example. So number one, I think we all of us need to do a better job of encouraging, whether it's administrator training programs or it's those state organizations like IPA, or the superintendent's associations, to consider, making distributed leadership a core philosophical approach to leadership that we should be learning more about. I think within your school, one of the things we can also do is think about aspiring leaders. And at my school, when I was principal and an administrator, we did a lot of work with either aspiring or brand new administrators, or teachers who are moving into a more titled, leadership position, of doing some leadership training in the first year or 2 or 3 of their leadership, to help them explore how distributed leadership might be a different approach than what they were used to. So I think there's ways we can work outside the system a little bit of our schools, and thinking about how are we helping administrators realize that this is a better way to go, and how can we work within our schools and our districts to create opportunities for us to learn about distributed leadership, especially those people who are moving into titled leadership roles.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Really appreciate it. And I love just the creative thinking there. As promised, would love to, as always, use the expertise. If there's any other thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to use the raise hand function, or feel free to pop it in the chat. You can wait a few more minutes. Well, if not, I'd love to leave you with a couple things. So my contact information, as I said, if you are someone who'd like to either learn more about this or just chat more about it, I'm always happy to engage in thought partnership. My email is up on the screen, as well as a link to our website, as well as a QR code that I think will work. TBD, I'm always wrestling with these QR codes. But what I will say is, for all of you joining, whether you are teachers, principals, or in ed adjacent orgs, thank you for spending some time exploring distributed leadership, and thank you for thinking about how this could and might, and envisioning what it would look like at your school. Really, really appreciate you engaging and all of your reflections. So thank you. Thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. With that, Arlen, I will throw it back to you in case there was any other official closeout things.
Wonderful, Ann. Thank you so much for this presentation, sharing this with all of us. And thank you to our participants for being here, commenting in the chat, and getting on the microphone. We appreciate that. As I mentioned, this will be recorded and a link will be sent out tomorrow. Feel free to share that with your administrators. It'll be wide open on YouTube, and they'll be able to watch the entire presentation along with the Q&A. I'll also be sending a link to an evaluation form, which, once completed by our Illinois participants, will issue you your ISB evidence of completion form for entering your 1 PD clock hour for attending this event today. You are free to go down to the lower right-hand corner of your screen and click the big red button that says leave. That will exit you out of the session, and I'll be following up via email tomorrow. Thanks again, everyone, for all your time, and Ann, thank you so much.